I drop up all the badges like the blonde and fucking fade away.
Immediate and complete reports of local blood and guts.
What happened was true. The most bizarre and brutal series of crimes
Let this serve as a warning that this is one of the most disturbing cases I have ever looked at. And while the victims survived, they most certainly shouldn't have. This case covers the graphic sexual assault of a very young victim at the hands of a 56-year-old man. A case that sets itself apart from others that have been in my channel before and others that I have covered. In Ansan, South Korea, a monstrous act of brutality unfolded on a December evening in 2008. The victim, an 8-year-old girl known only as Na Young, was subjected to a horrific ordeal at the hands of Cho Doo-soon, a 56-year-old male. The case would become a national spectacle, as the excuse given was that Cho Doo-soon was drunk. There is no pleasant or light way to explain these sorts of cases, but for the lack of a better term, this attack was not a quote ordinary incident by any means. This case is extremely violent, and the savagery of the attack makes the Peter Scully case, which involves Daisy's destruction, appear insignificant by comparison by the scale of violence. Cho Doo-soon was born October 18th in 1952. He dropped out of school in 1970, and shortly after would be arrested for his first criminal offense, stealing a bicycle. He was pretty much given a slap on the wrist for the offense, but this was just the beginning of Cho Doo-soon's escalations, as in 1972, he would be sentenced to 1 year and 6 months in a youth detention center for extorting money from a street stall. This habitual theft led to various charges over the years, and his behavior wasn't that of a calm, tactical thief either. Cho Doo-soon was violent, erratic, and often intoxicated. By 1977, he would again be arrested and notably charged, again for stealing, but this time they held his record against him, and he was charged with habitual theft, which earned him 8 months in prison. But Cho Doo-soon would quickly shift his interest from harassment and theft to violent sexual assault. He would target just about any young woman seemingly just out of impulse and attack them. In 1983, he beat and raped a 19-year-old so badly, she took over 30 days just to stabilize from the assault. However, he was only sentenced to 3 years in prison, and upon his release, he immediately returned to drinking and violent crime, mostly suffering citations for groping and beating on women, including the assault of a hostess at a bar. Already he has cemented himself as one of the most disgusting and prolific rapists in South Korea. It should also be noted that he has a wife, who has stood by him and even gave the excuse that alcohol made Cho commit the crimes. She once stated, "Cooking rice and side dishes, cleaning the home, and all the household work. My husband has done it for 20 years. He has never vented his anger, and he has always been hailed as a polite person." Cho Doo-soon would have 17 official victims by the time of his most notorious attack, the brutal kidnapping and rape of an 8-year-old girl in 2008. An assault that would earn Cho Doo-soon the title of South Korea's most notorious rapist and would spark outrage across the nation. The true identity of the victim has never been publicized for their protection, as they were a child at the time of the attack. The name given to the victim for the case is a pseudonym, Na Young. Na Young's family was impoverished, like many in our world. They struggled just to put food on the table, despite both parents working long hours. This left Na Young to be sort of a latchkey kid, an old term for the kids who were left to fend for themselves while their parents worked out of necessity. Often these children were more mature for their age and held to standards and sometimes ludicrous responsibilities depending on if their parents truly cared or if they were negligent. Na Young's family was not negligent. They were struggling and did what they could to provide. Na Young's father worked in a factory and her mother ran a small shop in the front of the house while doing housework and raising her daughter. At the time, she was 5 months pregnant. The baby was not planned and her husband did not know that a new child was on the way. Despite working so much, Na Young's mother still walked her to school each morning, which was only a few minute walk away from their home. But on the morning of December 11th, 2008, Na Young was running late and her mother was very busy with work, so Na Young had to walk alone. This was not too uncommon and still isn't in South Korea, with children around the age of 6 typically being responsible for getting themselves to school. After all, South Korea has one of the lowest crime rates in the entire world. But that doesn't mean bad things don't happen. And with that, we learn that a meager 3-minute walk turned into a child's living hell, just by the unfortunate threads of fate that day. It was a rainy, dreary day when Na Young would encounter 56-year-old Cho Doo-soon. He was heavily intoxicated when he stood before the young girl. He roughly grabbed hold of her arm and began to drag her to a nearby building, a church, telling her she needs to go to church. There, he wrestled her into the bathroom where he began to beat her viciously, punching her in the face and biting her on the cheeks. He then choked her and submerged the child's head in water to subdue her. And while reports state this was a bucket, what sort of bucket would be in a bathroom? The only thing I could conclude logically was that Cho Doo-soon began to drown this child in a toilet before he began his sexual assault. At this time, Na Young would slip in and out of consciousness as she began to drown. This is when Cho Doo-soon began to rape her. The assault was extremely violent, and while Cho was known for being violent, this act is among the most savage I have ever read about in my entire life. He caused so much physical damage to the child that she suffered internal organ injuries and permanent bone damage during the attack. He raped her in the vagina, anus, and ears. The assault was so barbaric that her intestines began to fall out of her rectum and fall apart during the attack. The scene was a bloodbath, and Cho Doo-soon was drenched in blood. He did not stop here, however. He shoved Na Young's intestines back in her body repeatedly and continued his assault. And when it wasn't feasible to continue doing that, he forced her to sit up on the toilet and continued that way with her ears. The attack lasted over a half an hour before Na Young was left to die, and Cho Doo-soon tossed her on the floor with cold water running in the sink and left the scene. However, she was not dead yet, and Na Young, at just 8 years old, after enduring only what could be described as a living nightmare, managed to call emergency services herself and was immediately brought to a hospital in critical condition. Reporters and students and bystanders alike all flocked to the scene to see what was happening, only knowing that a small child was just hauled off in EMS. At the time of the rescue, Na Young oscillated between periods of consciousness and mental confusion, but she was able to say her name and give her father's phone number. The doctors could not believe that Na Young was still alive. She had significant internal bleeding and major trauma to her face and abdomen. Cho inflicted permanent and non-permanent bone injuries and traumatic cuts in the abdomen, lower abdomen, and pelvis, which required extensive surgeries and over 8 months just to treat. At the time of her rescue, Na Young's anus had to be removed or she would bleed to death. As an alternative, a colonostomy was made. A colonostomy is an operation that creates an opening for the colon or large intestine through the abdomen. A colostomy may be temporary or permanent depending on the circumstances, and it is usually done after bowel surgery or an injury of this nature. Na Young was left with permanent damage to her lower abdomen, and she was told that she would be permanently disabled, unable to bear children. She needed 8 months, as I said, of treatment, and had to take trips to Seoul every weekend for those treatments. She suffers from severe PTSD as well. However, her horror was not yet over, as the case itself was muddled by prosecutors due to their negligence initially. The prosecution questioned her right after she came out of surgery and made her sit upright and answer the same questions 4 times due to the prosecutors making mistakes while recording. They also violated protocol in obtaining testimony from a minor by taping her in public. Prosecution also failed to show the arrest videotape of Cho, which would have eliminated the need for her to take the witness stand. She was made to be propped up with a colostomy bag as she testified against Cho, and had to relive her ordeal in front of an open court and her assailant. And to make matters worse, because she testified that he smelled of alcohol, instead of a life sentence, Cho Doo-soon's sentence was reduced to a paltry 12 years in prison. He then compulsively and rather idiotically wrote over 300 times to the judge, and I quote, "I am not a sick monster who rapes an 8-year-old girl." But that's exactly what Cho Doo-soon was. This sparked outrage as a violent and dangerous rapist was basically getting off because of his own disgusting habits. As a result, Na Young's parents filed a lawsuit against the prosecution for subjugating their daughter to physical and psychological distress, which they won. The settlement didn't come into 2011, however, but they were awarded the equivalence of a $13 million settlement as compensation. And while money provides stability and material joy, it cannot directly heal the wounds of trauma. Na Young only watches cartoons and self-deemed safe television as to avoid any exposure to the topic of sexual assault. Her trauma is profoundly deep and saddening. PTSD and CPTSD can be crippling, and to make matters worse, Cho Doo-soon was released on December 12th of 2020, 12 years to the day of Na Young's assault. He went to live with his wife in Ansan, just under a mile away from Na Young's home. Rightfully so, this was horrific news to the family and the city itself, so 71 security cameras would be placed around Ansan for the safety of residents who fear Cho's release. And by May of 2021, the South Korean Ministry of Justice and Ansan City's government revealed that just the tracking and monitoring of Cho has cost over $200 million just in the first 4 months. Cho himself claims he is very sorry, but the public as well as myself would like to see a rather different outcome here. A solution to the sickness of predators like Cho, which is easy enough to grasp, yet justice seems to not want to accept. Unfortunately, regardless of our desires for true justice, Cho Doo-soon walks free, suffering a mere parole violation type charge in March of 2024 for breaking curfew. And in most recent news regarding this case, comes from just a few days ago on Halloween, October 31st of 2024. Cho was moving just a few miles away, and even this sparked outrage and fear. The question is, why do this? There is a solution, a cheaper one, as it is ridiculous that police installed yet another monitoring system at his home and added 35 surveillance cameras, brighter streetlights, and police booths to Cho's new neighborhood to both monitor his movements and deter people who have threatened his safety. The public wants him dead. And in 2021, Cho experienced an assault at his residence perpetrated by a vigilante, resulting in minor injuries. The would-be hero, a man in his 20s, reportedly posed as law enforcement to gain entry, and subsequently assaulting Cho with a blunt object, presumably a bat or a club. Unfortunately, this attack on Cho's life was unsuccessful, and he still remains free and alive to this very day. He has reportedly moved into a house just a 5-minute walk from an elementary school and daycare, and there are about 10 elementary, middle, and high schools within the 2-mile range of his home. He also receives subsidies from the government to survive. Essentially, he's on welfare. As for Na Young, despite her trauma, despite the odds of surviving, and so much suffering, she is now in her 20s, and within years was thriving in life and academics. After receiving psychiatric treatment, she started attending school again, and even attended a hagwon across the street from the very church she was assaulted in. A hagwon basically being a very well-put paid school, say primary school or a private school. And a movie titled Hope was released in 2013 inspired by the case. To me, this is one of the most horrifying cases I have ever read to date. And fortunately, the victim survived. This is not the first nor the last incident of its kind, however. So be safe out there. And if you have any recommendations for cases like this or others that you want me to cover that you think may be extreme, obscure, or just not talked about, let me know. And remember, if it bleeds, it leads.